toward the end of chapter 14 in Isaiah, and barring any unforeseen accidents, we'll get into chapter 15. But knowing how some of y'all enjoy talking, I'm not promising anything. But in chapter 14, we're still dealing with in this section, the fall of Philistia, verses 28 through verse 32. So that's the section that we're in, and we had gotten down to verse 31, where it says, "Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Philistina art dissolved, for there shall come from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed times." Philistia as a whole, and each city, is represented as howling and lamenting because of the destruction and the desolation that's going to be upon them. The smoke from the north might be the Assyrian army, which destroys the cities that it comes upon, and they would be coming from the north. If you keep in mind the basic outlay of the area, that entire territory, you have the Fertile Crescent going up, which is Tigris-Euphrates area. That's where Babylon would be. And then actually between that and the land of Canaan, there's a desert. So nations would go up north of that desert and through Syria and then come down from the north. So they would be coming from the north in that way, even though it is the Assyrian army. And another idea that is expressed that some believe this is expressing is that it is the signal fire whereby a hostile army was called together. In other words, they started a signal fire and the army comes together. So it would be calling the army together. The none shall be alone in his appointed times is that basically there will be no straggler in the ranks of the army. They're not going to be left behind. There are not going to be any stragglers there. The whole army is there. So that's the idea that's being presented. It could be that, which would be that first idea that they're coming from the north, as the smoke from the north being the Assyrian army coming down south to defeat them.
And wouldn't that kind of language by Isaiah to the wicked people of Canaan, Jerusalem, and the surrounding suburbs cause the wicked people to be scared because they knew they had been involved in idolatry and knew that their judgment was on its way toward them? Wouldn't that be involved in that?
Not necessarily.
Their conscience reverting them, they didn't want to repent?
Not necessarily, because they're idolaters. That's what they were. They believed in their God, that their God would defeat the other gods.
These are Israelites.
Well, Israel, the Israelites should have known better, but they didn't. And you get to the point where they don't know what's right. Look at Jeremiah. You've got the prophet saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. They weren't able to blush. All of those statements. Why? Because the Israelites had totally gone away from God. So, well, that's Josiah's time frame, which would be, which would probably be after this. That's true, but either way, I mean, you've still got Israel is totally apostate at this point in time. They don't. Think of apostate congregations in the Lord's church today. You start pointing out the error, and that's nothing to them because they don't have any respect for God and His Word. They've totally blocked out what's right and what's wrong. They don't have a sense of that anymore.
They figured it was off the
So.
Bible and left it in their nightstand. If they don't actually leave it, they find out as well leave it. They don't have to do it.
They just don't have a knowledge of what's right and wrong anymore. Whether they study it or not makes no difference. They don't have that knowledge. So verse 31, what shall one then answer the messengers of the nation? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. Basically, this is dealing with Philistia, or the Philistines, would send ambassadors to Jerusalem. And those ambassadors would be entreating the aid of Jerusalem, obviously, and fighting against the Assyrians. They were to answer, and this is the last sentence, they were to answer the messengers of the nation in this way, that God founded Zion, the Israelite nation, Jerusalem in particular, and God would protect it. Thus, they were going to put their trust in God and not any nation that might seek their aid, any confederacy which they might make with foreign nations. They're going to place their trust in God. Now, that's what they should answer. Did they always do that? No. But in this case with the Assyrian army, God did protect Jerusalem in a very effective way, and that is by the death of 185,000 of the Assyrian soldiers. So what he says here, that the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it, God's going to protect the people, the Jerusalem, that city that he has founded. Yahweh is still in charge. Don't place your trust in nations. Don't place your trust in armaments. From a military standpoint, Assyria should have defeated Jerusalem. Don't place your trust in military armaments. Place your trust in Yahweh. Chapter 15 then is going to be dealing with the burden.
I was talking to him a while ago about the poor of the people shall trust in him. That's the poor in spirit, right? It's not about physically poor. Why would they connect trust to poor?
That's dealing with Jerusalem and the people of Jerusalem.
But the poor in spirit, they're living in
it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with the poor in spirit or not, even those who are haughty in spirit. God was going to protect Jerusalem, and that is dealing with Jerusalem, and God's protecting Jerusalem. That means all of the people in Jerusalem at that time.
Why would that last phrase have trust connected to the poor? By extension, at the end of the sentence, is what we're talking about.
It's trusting in God, not in military armaments, and not in the associations which they could make with other nations. Chapter 15, the burden of Moab, is what this is going to be dealing with. Let me go through Moab first, and just kind of a background and history of Moab. It's a long association with Israel, so this will be a little bit lengthy, but I think it will be profitable for us. We will go back to Genesis chapters 18 and 19, where God is going to destroy Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain. But he reveals that destruction to Lot, who then escapes that area. But his wife, of course, looks back, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. So the only ones who escape are Lot and his two daughters. Those two daughters, fearing the end of the family line then, they make a plan, get Lot drunk, and each of them, one will lay with him one night and the other one the other night. So they do that, and from the union of Lot with his oldest daughter was born Moab, who becomes the father of the Moabites. And you can read that in Genesis 19:30 through 38. We won't take the time to read it. We won't take the time to read a lot of these passages, but hopefully just reference them. They were, of course, then closely associated with the Ammonites, because Ammon was the son born to the youngest daughter. So they are often associated together, the Moabites and the Ammonites. By the time of the Exodus, when Israel leaves Egypt, the Moabites were a numerous people, and they occupied the district from actually the plain of Heshbon to the Wadi of Kiriah. And although they dealt commercially with Israel when they were traveling to the Promised Land, and we see that in Deuteronomy 2, verses 28 and 29. Yet when Israel comes to their land, they refuse to allow Israel to go through the land. And we see that in Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 4, along with Judges chapter 11, verses 17 and 18. It's referenced again. God would not allow Israel and Moses to attack Moab. Deuteronomy 2 and verse 9. Possibly because of the kinship between Israel and Moab. And that again going back to Lot and Abraham. Balak was distressed by Israel's success, and so he hires Balaam to curse Israel. Read about that in Numbers chapters 22, 23, and 24. For such action on the Moabites' part, a Moab was excluded from the congregation of the Lord even to the 10th generation. It says, shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever, Deuteronomy 23 and verse 3. Prior to Israel's crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land, though, the Moabite women seduced Israel to licentious idolatry. And we see that in Numbers chapter 25. We also read about it a little bit in Revelation 2 and verse 14.
That was when Phinehas distinguished himself, wasn't it?
Don't remember offhand. Early in the period of the judges then, moving through history quickly, Eglon, king of Moab, invaded the Israelite lands as far as Jericho, or the city of palm trees. He oppressed Israel for 18 years until he was assassinated by the judge Ehud of the tribe of Benjamin. Judges 3 verses 12 through 20. Later in that period of the judges, Elimelech, an Ephraimite of Bethlehem, moved to Moab. His sons, two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, married Moabite women. Those women's names, Orpah and Ruth. After Elimelech and his sons died, Ruth, of course, moved back to Bethlehem with Naomi and later married Boaz. Boaz and Ruth then become ancestors of King David and, of course, later of Jesus. After Saul becomes king, he warred with the Moabites, 1 Samuel 14, verses 47. And the last friendly relations between Moab and Israel would have been when David placed his parents under the protection of the king of Moab. And that would be when he was being pursued by Saul. So Saul is pursuing David. David places his parents under the protection of the king of Moab. That's 1 Samuel 22, verses 3 and 4. After David becomes king, though, he overcomes them and places them under tribute, along with executing many of the Moabites. 2 Samuel 8 and 2 Chronicles 18. After Solomon's death, the Moabs broke free, but then were subjugated again by Omri, the king of Israel, or Judah actually. Upon the death of Ahab, Moab refused to pay tribute and thus asserted their independence and made an alliance with the Ammonites. Remember them? Along with some others, and they intended to invade Judah. Jehoram, the king of Judah, decides to invade Moab and tried to regain control, and he asked King Jehoshaphat for help along that line. They, along with the Edomites, then unite and completely overthrow Moab, 2 Kings chapter 3, along with 2 Chronicles chapter 20. The year of Elisha's death had bands or groups of Moabites invade Israel, according to 2 Kings 13 and verse 20. During the latter part of the 8th century BC, then, Moab paid tribute to Tiglath-Pileser and Sennacherib, who were the kings of Assyria again. Upon Assyria's fall, Moab was once again free. They no longer had to pay that tribute to Assyria now that Assyria has fallen. During the reign of Jehoiakim, they entered into Jerusalem, 2 Kings 24 and verse 2. When Jerusalem fell to Babylon, some of the Jews fled to Moab for refuge. However, Gedaliah was appointed governor, and those individuals returned, Jeremiah 40 and verses 11 and following. According to Josephus, the Jewish historian, Nebuchadnezzar subdued them, and they fell successively under the control of the Persians and various Arab groups. They disappeared from history as a nation. However, in post-exilic times, they were still known as race. So the nation is gone, but the race still existed. And we see that actually in Ezra chapter 9 and verse 1, along with Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1 and 23. According to Josephus again, Alexander Jannaeus placed them under tribute during the 2nd century BC. So that is really a very short history of the Moabites, and specifically their dealings with Israel along that line. So in verses 1 through 9 of chapter 15, we're going to have a description of Moab's strong cities. And he begins by, in verse 1, the burden of Moab, because in the night Ar of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. Because in the night Kir of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. Ar and Kir are two outstanding cities in Moab, and Isaiah is prophesying of their destruction. It seems as if Ar might be the capital and Kir might be the chief fortress of Moab. But either way, they are chief cities in Moab. In both situations, because in the night, and in the night, seems to indicate the suddenness that this takes place with. Doesn't take a long period of time. It doesn't take a month. It doesn't take a year. But in the night. So it seems like it's saying this is a sudden situation where they are overthrown. In verse 2 then, he has gone up to excuse me. He has gone up to Bajath and to Dibon, the high places, to weep. Moab shall howl over Nebo and over Medeba. All their heads shall be baldness, and every beard cut off. This first name, Bajath, or Bajath, means house. It refers to the temple of Baal, though. Just as the house of God is the temple in Old Testament, both phrases, house of God, the temple of God, have reference to the church today. Well, here now then, Bajath, house, having reference to their temple to Baal. Dibon is one of the high places. Are any of you familiar with the Moabite stone? Have you heard of that? Yep. It was found in, guess where? Dibon. So this is the location of where the Moabite stone is found. It would be one of the places to which the Moabites would go up to howl and weep because of the destruction, the pain, the anguish that they were going through. We read many times even of the Israelites in relationship to the high places. Well, that was an elevated location. Why would the high places be important? Well, they thought, incorrectly of course, but they thought that the higher you get, the closer you are to God. So during the period of the kings, and during the divided kingdom, many of the kings of Judah would bring about a reform of the people, and they were considered good kings, but a lot of times it states of those good kings that they did not remove the high places, because they would build temples on those high places, and they should have removed them, but they didn't. Well, here you have a high place in Moab, and thus these high places, just like the Israelites, except now then in relationship to Baal. And now then they're going there to weep and to howl because of what's happening to them. They would shave their heads and cut their beards, which was a sign of humility and grief. It was, you see the cutting off of the beard many times by an enemy as a sign to humiliate the people. Okay, Dale.
But remember the time when David was trying to show diplomacy and kindness, and they cut clothes in half? Would that have like similarities?
Well, they also shaved off half of their beards.
Right.
So yes, it has the exact same situation, except they only shaved off half of the beards, and David told them, stay where you are until your beards grow back. But they did it as a sign to humiliate those individuals. Well, that's what happened to these ambassadors that David had sent. They cut their skirts off, and they cut off half of their beards. But yes, they oftentimes cut off the skirts like unto that. And we... something about miniskirts there. Well, I imagine we could get off on that subject, but it was obviously a sign to humiliate the people. Here they were doing it because they are humiliated and they are in great grief and sorrow over what is taking place. So later on, when we get to it, and I think it's, I always forget if it's chapter 49 or 47. I think it's 47, where it talks about they were going to uncover their nakedness. Why? Because the skirt was cut off and showing thus the thighs. And when there is thus the uncovering of the thighs, God considered that nakedness. We learn that from that passage. Well, you see the same thing here. And what you're talking about, the cutting off of those skirts and thus the uncovering of the thighs to humiliate them. I think it is obvious with some people you could not humiliate them no matter what you did to them, especially in relationship to clothing, unless, of course, you made them wear a suit. Now, that would be so humiliating to them, probably. Now, I'm saying that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, so understand that. But Yeah, there's some people you could not humiliate that way today, but back then, to be uncovered like unto that was humiliating to them. It would be well, just think, understanding we have some standards and we have an aspect of modesty. What if someone made you take off your clothing and allowed you to keep on your underclothes, but then go out in the street and walk down the street all day long that way? It would be humiliating, wouldn't it? At least for us, because we have some standards. That's the way they felt, though. Thus, the way we would feel along that line. So, yes, it was to a sign of both humility, or humiliation, maybe might be a better term in that, and also a sign of grief and sorrow, sadness. So verse 3, in their streets they shall gird themselves with sackcloth on the tops of their houses, and in their streets everyone shall howl, weeping abundantly. So you see the continuation of that idea that in the streets of the city, those streets that had not been destroyed, they will be wearing sackcloth, which again is an expression of great grief and sadness or sorrow. Okay,
Where you got weeping abundantly, mine has weeping bitterly. Not version.
Okay. And that's a difference that doesn't make any matter. I mean, it is going to be they are weeping abundantly, they are weeping bitterly. It's the same idea. They had gone up to or even as they had gone up to the high places weeping, now then they're going to be coming down howling and weeping still, because the high places was where they would meet with their gods. And their gods didn't do anything to help them out. They didn't avail anything. So now then, they're returning from those places where they were going to meet their gods and get all of their help, and no help came. So now then, they're coming back down, actually weeping abundantly, or bitterly, as Dale's has. Could be translated, descending to weep. In other words, they're descending from the high places weeping, or to weep. So again, just a continued aspect of their great sorrow that's coming because of their destruction. In verse 4, and Heshbon shall cry, and Elah, their voices shall be heard even to Jahaz. Therefore the armed soldiers of Moab shall cry out, his life shall be grievous unto him. Their crying is so loud. It's expressed not literally, but in a figurative way, to express how great of sorrow it is, that it's going to be heard all the way in Heshbon and Elul. The cry will be heard in Jahaz. Heshbon was 16 miles And Elil would be 17 miles to Jahaz. So that shows, again, you're not going to hear someone, even a group of individuals, 17, 16 miles away. And they're weeping and howling. But he's not talking from a literal standpoint here. The grief, the sorrow is going to be so great, is what he's talking about, that sorrow is going to be heard all over the place. Even Moab's courageous men, their warriors, tremble and cry out over the distress. These strong men, these soldiers, armed soldiers, they would have been used to death, destruction, annihilation even of cities and people. It would have been something that would have been very common to them. And thus, for them to be weeping, and it's crying out, grievous unto them, shows how great this is as far as its effect and as far as the destruction is concerned, that it would even affect the soldiers in that way. In verse 5 then my heart shall cry out for Moab. His fugitives shall flee into Zoar, an heifer of 3 years old. For by the mounting up of Luhith, with weeping shall they go up, or go it up. For in the way of Hornanim shall they raise up a cry of destruction. Even though soundly condemning Moab, you now have, in a sense, Isaiah sympathizing with them. I think we can learn a good lesson along this line. We must soundly condemn sin. We cannot tolerate it. We cannot not associate with it. We must rebuke it, soundly condemn it, but yet we need to have compassion on the person who is in sin. Nothing really surprising in that, because look at God. Can he associate with sin? Obviously not. Did he soundly condemn it and even punish it in all of its forms in various ways? Well, obviously he did. The Old Testament is replete with history dealing with that very thing. And yet he had love for the sinner. That even when we were enemies, Christ died for us, Romans 5 and verse 8. So there's the hatred of sin, but yet compassion on the sinner. That's what Isaiah is doing here and what's being expressed. My heart cries out for Moab. Now, some people might say, Isaiah, why are you having compassion on them? Why is your heart crying out for them? They're getting their just deserts. But it shows his compassion, his love for, yes, even those who were wicked and evil and in sin. And we need to have that same type of compassion toward people.
Jonah didn't have that kind of compassion for a while, though.
Well, as far as we know, Jonah never did. We're kind of left hanging in regards to Jonah. He did not have that compassion. That's true. He goes out to the side of Nineveh and he pouts that God doesn't destroy them. Even though they had repented, he still wanted their destruction. We're kind of left with him at that point, so we don't know the outcome. But he should have had compassion, and that's what God expresses to, shouldn't I have compassion on this city where there's 600,000 who don't know their right hand from their left hand? So whatever the number is, whether it's 60, 600,000, it doesn't really matter. Somebody can turn over their last verse in Jonah and find out, but it doesn't matter. It's still, this concept is God had compassion on them. And Jonah didn't. We need to have compassion on people, on those who are in sin and caught up with it. Now then, let me say one other thing, and then I'll get to you, Henry. That compassion should demonstrate itself in our teaching them the truth, showing them the error of their way and showing them the way to get out of it. Now, to just say, "Oh, I'm sorry for your situation, I'm sorry you're in sin," that's not real compassion. If you don't tell them how to get out of it, to alleviate the sin. True compassion shows them how to be saved. Okay, Henry.
This situation kind of reminds me of the situation we can get in today by going to war with other countries. Being put in a situation where you got to kill somebody. I just don't like that. You kill somebody's father or somebody's son or something. I've often wondered. Fortunately, I didn't have to go. I thought it was.
Let me avoid the question of the war. It would be, even those who believe in going to war, it would be a difficult situation for those individuals. That's why,
But it's something we've always done,
yeah, there have always been war. Let me add, that might be one from the statistics that I've read. The majority of soldiers who even shoot their weapons do not kill anyone. It's unusual for them to actually. The majority of people are killed by a few people. So that might be part of the reason for that. But we'll begin kind of in verse 5 then, Lord willing, next week.